Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Sunday show. We're going to be talking Lenin and the American working class. Before we get too far ahead, how's it going, Matt?
It's going very, very well, David. It's good to be speaking with you.
Yeah, man, looking forward to a little bit of vacation coming up. We'll let y'all know what we have in store for next week. It'll be a lot of fun, but looking to getting a little time off, I gotta say.
Yes, I concur.
In the, I bought a Christmas tree today. Uh, it's like classic kind of setup, big tent. And you show up and there's nobody, it didn't really look like anybody was there. And there was three people just sitting behind the cash register. And, I wasn't being impertinent or anything, but I sort of walked up and I was like, is anybody going to help me out or, tell me
Yeah,
what to
yeah.
do? And the guy just looks at me and it was like 1:55 or something. And he's just like, I'll help you out a little bit, but my shift doesn't start until 2. Wait, and I was just like, I think a lot of other people would have been mad, but for me, I was like, hell yeah, man, I love it. Like, do not do any work until you're getting paid for sure.
Exactly, absolutely. That is, yeah, especially those sorts of where it's not a formalized job. Like my grandpa sold Christmas trees
Yeah.
for a while, and I remember him just be in this like little tiny like telephone booth style thing in the midst of all these Christmas trees in this park in downtown. And yeah, that's very funny. I respect to that guy for standing up for his rights as a worker.
No, I agree. Like, we need more of that attitude, I have to say. Um, but I remember we talking about workers for sure, maybe a little bit indirectly. Last week, we talked about the three components of Marxism, which is a really early text by Lenin. Breaking down why he finds Marxism to be a sort of, extremely valuable philosophy for, making revolution and for understanding history and society in general. This week, we're going to take it a little bit more concrete and revisit a letter written by Lenin in 1918 to the American working class, which I think it's a very interesting historical document because this is a kind of critical time in the Russian Revolution when he's writing this, and two, I think it really does show the seriousness with that Lenin sort of took toward the idea of international revolution, and that this movement, basically like not that these kind of revolutionary movements could not be isolated, and they sort of needed to build a broad working class, international working class movement to be successful. And I mean, I was just saying to Matt before we went live, just to sort of contextualize this. This is, I think, first printed in 1918 in August, which was just a month after they had killed, as part of the Russian Revolution, Nicholas II of Russia. And I was just saying to Matt, it's an interesting moment for Lenin to be writing this, one, to the American working class, and two, within the revolution itself, because it is very close to being triumphant. But all the while, the Americans and the British in particular are starting to sort of foment counter revolution against the Bolsheviks and the working class revolution there. That's one thing that I think a lot of people forget. There's all this freak out about Russian meddling in the American elections in 2016, but the Russians have never sent troops or armed troops in the United States that's tried to overthrow the government. In the case of the early Soviet Union, they absolutely were, and were quite adamant about it. Though it is interesting to note that the Russian Revolution was seen very positively by most Americans at this time. It took a few years of serious propaganda to sort of like shift public opinion against the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, wasn't that who was the American writer that spent time in writing about the revolution? I forget. I'm gonna actually look it up.
Yeah, I can't remember his name right now, but he was writing for one of the major New York newspapers at the time, and he had sort of embedded himself with with the Bolsheviks. Well, he wrote the book, what is it, 14 Days That Shook the World?
Right, that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
And it's an on the ground account. And it's funny because, she, there's so much propaganda when it comes to learning about the Russian Revolution in the United States. And sometimes people sort of throw his accounts away, even though he was a first-hand on the ground. He's getting first-hand accounts. He was a reporter on the ground who was, I think, the way that it is sort of, at least is sort of portrayed, is that he was sort of ambivalent about the cause of like socialism and the kind of ideology behind this movement, but he slowly becomes more and more enamored with the system and what they're trying to achieve. It is interesting because a lot of like American academics will say like, oh well, you can't read this firsthand account because this person, while watching these events, became a partisan. You know what I mean? Like this person was convinced by what they were seeing, so somehow like what they saw shouldn't mean anything.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
I don't know, which is just like the most like kind of BS example of like how a lot of Americans sort of privilege like neutrality above all else, right? It's like if an account is like moving enough, if you're seeing something before your eyes that's sort of like challenging the ideas that you had going into an event, I don't know, I think that's extremely worthwhile.
Well, I mean, that in a way, that's like a classic conversion narrative almost, and that is in certain circumstances something received really well by Americans.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
And I noted only that. It's just an interesting moment in the Russian Revolution too, because you're starting to see these kind of splinters within the movement. I was noting to Matt that Lenin himself actually was very much against the execution of the Romanovs, not because he didn't want justice to be done, or that he thought that it was dangerous for to basically have something that people could rally around after the fact. But I think he really wanted there to be like a proper trial. But Trotsky just sort of did it anyway. And Lenin apparently had sent like a letter or telegram or something of that nature to sort of say like, well, I'm glad you've got them, hold them there. And Trotsky basically responds like, oh, I'm sorry, got a little carried away.
Whoops.
But Lenin later said that he actually thinks that Trotsky's decision was correct. So take that as either him, changing his mind eventually, or sort of standing with, Trotsky as time went on.
And that's the thing. Like, these are questions that pretty much revolutions, particularly against feudal aristocracies, often have to confront. Because on the one hand, like, it's bad to kill in any situation. I agree with that. I don't like capital punishment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like state murder. On the other hand, royals that are alive become rallying points for the counter-revolution / restoration. And and that's just fundamentally something I don't expect any of us to have to confront that sort of thing. But it's like, it's not like, I feel like you said, like the way we're taught about these things, it's like, holy, look at that bloodthirsty.
Yeah, they're just like, I mean, it's like the blood, and then also just sort of like they're out of control, right? Their passions are too inflamed. When it was a lot more tactical than that. But I think we should. This text, I mean, it is certainly about the Russian Revolution, and also, again, for people who just aren't familiar with the history, this is all happening in the theater of World War I. So a decent amount of this text is actually trying to kind of dispel rumors that the Russians, because Lenin famously, they pull out of the war. Lenin called the World War I, again, if people aren't familiar, I'll just very briefly, because this is a really important part of socialist history. One of the proudest traditions of the international socialist movement was its principled opposition to World War I, which undoubtedly, I think World War II is a little bit more interesting ideologically on this. Like, World War I was just clearly an imperial war. It was a war set to sort of carve up the last remaining parts of the globe for further colonization, and to sort of remake the map of Europe in favor of the Central Powers. So it was something that that Lenin and Debs and many other socialists were vehemently opposed to, and this is also where you start to see the crack up between when people talk about Rosa Luxemburg and these kind of early shifts in the early socialist movement. This is one of the critical moments where basically the question is, do you as a socialist movement stand with the international working class, or do you start to retreat into petty nationalism?
And actually there was a good discussion on this exact hinge point with Danny Bessner and Matt Chrisman on Chapo, if people want to check that out, but for a little bit more context. But
I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
No, but again, because you're going to hear a lot in this text, and we should just jump right into it. But a lot of talk about this kind of putting international socialism above the concept of nationalism, and this was a very active fight, and one that I don't know. It's been a while since we've sort of seen. I mean, I think opposition to American imperialism sort of like fills that role in some way. And maybe, there's a bit of American privilege here, where it's like easy for us to sort of be against American imperial wars. But you see this across like a lot of other European socialist movements even today. It's like it's easy to oppose the American monster, right? Because it's the big one. And you could even be a nationalist in Europe and still oppose the American kind of imperial war, which would be very different from like a principled internationalist socialist position, if that makes sense, right? It's like because America's like the big foreign other, it's easy to sort of oppose them, and we haven't seen something sort of fill that gap. We, at least on a like international organization level. Obviously, there's been principled opposition to the war in Iraq, Vietnam, etc. But like we haven't seen that as strong as a position as it was in 1917, when it ends up driving a wedge between a lot of socialist movements around the globe.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like, even there was like Mark Twain, not a socialist, but like was part of groups to like abolish war. The imagination at that time was entirely different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this is a letter that was published in Pravda, and then sent to the to the American working people, to all of the different socialist newspapers and places that would publish it. And I think we'll just it's not a super long text, so I think we'll try to go through most of it. There's some bits that are like just so specific towards the World War I bit, and they're not unimportant. But I think that like this, we're not just doing this to go over like a history of World War I and the early Soviet Union. It's actually like, how does Lenin view the American Revolution? I think it's very interesting in relation to a lot of contemporary conversations that we're having today. And we can just jump right into it.
Cool.
Let me pull this up for everyone.
All right, here we go.
Comrades, a Russian Bolshevik who took part in the 1905 revolution and who lived in your country for many years afterwards, has offered to convey my letter to you. I have accepted his proposal, all the more gladly because just at the present time the American revolutionary workers have to play an exceptionally important role as uncompromising enemies of American imperialism, the freshest, strongest and latest, in joining in the worldwide slaughter of nations for the division of capitalist profits. At this very moment, the American multimillionaires, these modern slave owners, have turned an exceptionally tragic page in the bloody history of bloody imperialism by giving their approval, whether direct or indirect, open or hypocritically concealed, makes no difference, to the armed expedition launched by the brutal Anglo-Japanese imperialists for the purpose of throttling the first socialist republic. The history of modern, civilized America opened with one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars of which there have been so few compared to the vast number of wars of conquest which, like the present imperialist war, were caused by squabbles among kings, landowners or capitalists over the division of usurped lands or ill-gotten gains. That was the war the American people waged against the British robbers who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery. In the same ways, these civilized bloodsuckers are still oppressing and holding in colonial slavery hundreds of millions of people in India, Egypt, and all parts of the world.
Can I just say, I like his use of terms like the bloodsuckers and the like modern slave drivers, or like because that's the mantle that these people literally took up, and like I don't even think it's really I think it's more descriptive than it is. And I think we need to bring this back a little bit. You're still muted, David.
Apologies. The thing about Lenin is this is somebody who understood the role of like passion and like serious cold analysis. Like one of my favorite Lenin quotes is, keep your heart on fire and your brain on ice, right? Which is you can very much get from the way that he writes. I mean, he's going to go through, pretty sophisticated arguments, but never, ever, ever does he do so in a dispassionate voice. Don't let the computer, reader, confuse you. Like this is like, this is standing up and smashing your hands on the table kind of writing. But beyond like just the prose, like I wanted to start with one of the reasons I wanted to read this text actually is because of this first bit when he talks about the history of America, because we do have these conversations about like a reckoning with American history on this show, and I think across like the broader left right now, which I think is good. But I think that it's sometimes worth seeing what the kind of outside, and more importantly outside Marxist perspectives of like these critical moments in history represent. And in this, he's talking about you know, the America is sort of, is born out of one of these really liberating, really revolutionary war, of which there have been so few compared to the vast number of wars of conquest, right? Like he right here is making a pretty radical claim, at least by the way I think a lot of American Marxists would talk about the American Revolutionary War, right? That it really did represent a quite a radical break. And I think this is going back to like the first text of Lenin that we did, that kind of dialectical position. I think a lot of people sort of fail at being able to wrestle with. Undoubtedly, the American revolution was a bourgeois revolution. It was an incomplete revolution. It was not a radical Marxist socialist revolution by any stretch of the imagination. But it was radical in the sense of being something that was completely washing away the powers of the foreign powers of monarchy and aristocracy in American society. Yes, it replaces that with the system of bourgeois slavery, the system of entrenched American slavery as well, right? But as a force, it's breaking through these kind of extremely archaic and unmoving systems in a way that, so even when they were oppressing people, and even when they were contradicting the own terms that sort of set up the system of American Revolution, the American founding documents, they had to come up with some kind of excuse for why they were doing it, right? Because, again, even though it wasn't in place in the sense of all men are created equal in actuality, right? It was such a part of a founding mythos and ethos and the idea of living in America means, you're living in a democracy, that it always has that kind of potential of progressive bent to it. Because it sort of has to match the claims that it's making to justify itself.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a little bit lost in my own thought that I was.
Oh no, I mean, I just think that it's worthwhile to recognize here, because I think a lot of American people who consider themselves to be Leninists would think if you were to give them that text right there, they would be like, oh, this is a reactionary, oh, this is Kautsky writing, or somebody that they don't like. It's no, this is Lenin, and this is not some early Lenin or Lenin, this is Lenin at the height of revolutionary fervor and power saying this about the American Revolution, right?
Yeah, and in a certain sense, it makes sense that they would have more in sympathy with the American Revolution, because that was also overthrowing a king, right?
Yes.
And that we kind of we're over that now. Come on, what are you going to do for me lately, sort of thing. But yeah, we talked about earlier, having to decide if you're going to off a royal aristocracy line. And there's also we'll get into this next part here where we're talking about America, the emergence of America, and to see his recognition of that and at the time is very interesting.
Yeah, let's get back to it.
About 150 years have passed since then. Bourgeois civilization has borne all its luxurious fruits. America has taken first place among the free and educated nations in level of development of the productive forces of collective human endeavor, in the utilization of machinery and of all the wonders of modern engineering. At the same time, America has become one of the foremost countries in regard to the depth of the abyss which lies between the handful of arrogant multimillionaires who wallow in filth and luxury, and the millions of working people who constantly live on the verge of pauperism. The American people, who set the world an example in waging a revolutionary war against feudal slavery, now find themselves in the latest, capitalist stage of wage slavery to a handful of multimillionaires, and find themselves playing the role of hired thugs who, for the benefit of wealthy scoundrels, throttled the Philippines in 1898 on the pretext of liberating them, and are throttling the Russian Socialist Republic in 1918 on the pretext of protecting it from the Germans.
I mean, that bit certainly speaks for itself, but it's worth highlighting. One, I think the inclusion of the American imperial conquest of the Philippines is really crucial, because if you look at the history of America really becoming an imperial nation, I mean, this is not the first, and it's certainly not the last, but is a key shift in American imperialism, not only because of its like brutality, but the fact that we've done terrible things in the in North America for sure from the get go, but like now we're exporting this into to Asia.
It's like, oh, maybe it's going to stop on the West Coast, and nope, I'm going to jump right over. Let's get in that Pacific.
And I think again he like really develops there too the the kind of the movement of the early American Revolution. Okay, it breaks the system of like feudal slavery, and then it replaces it with wage slavery controlled by the American billionaires, right? Like, I think that's the way to sort of dance and think like a Marxist about history. And I think it's something that a lot of people really struggle with, is that they think everything has to be sort of seen in the final analysis, right? So incomplete movements being wrong because they're incomplete, right? Rather, like the Marxist, dialectical materialist theory is not a theory of like static, right? It's not a theory that you just sort of look at things only in their own time. You look at things as a part of, a moving society, a moving history. And therein you can see, the kind of radical potential of the early American Revolution, and then see what develops out of it. That's one of the fundamental contradictions, is like you break from the control of the king, and then you replace it with the control of the multimillionaire, who, yes, create a lot of things that are incredibly progressive. I mean, the productive capacity of not just America, but the globe under capitalism is nothing short than incredible. The contradiction and the thing that we're trying to break is that to sustain that level of production, to be able to do all the things that capitalism can do, you have to hold the vast majority of people, in Lenin's words, on the verge of pauperism.
Yeah, that was very interesting. And also the millionaires are using that capacity to basically order people around the globe to murder people and reproduce the system.
And let it be known too that like, let's just say like, and they don't even want, like, for example, like bourgeois revolution globally. The American millionaires, right? They stand very much, in the case of the early Soviet Union, Russia at this time, as the reactionary force, as the force standing with the, with the monarchs, with the old feudal powers to maintain feudalism, right? It creates this kind of poison. And if hypocrisy were a sin, many people would be in hell. But like, these folks are not just hypocritical to themselves. They are now standing with the very forces that they said that they needed to break for their own profits to come from, right? Like,
right, yeah.
It goes beyond just like, oh, you're saying two things out of the side of your mouth. It's actually like, you are now in a position where maintaining feudalism is to your benefit, right? What a table turn it has been.
Right. Now we're in a position where no one bats an eye when we're supporting the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Get back to it.
The 4 years of the imperialist slaughter of nations, however, have not passed in vain. The deception of the people by the scoundrels of both robber groups, the British and the German, has been utterly exposed by indisputable and obvious facts. The results of the 4 years of war have revealed the general law of capitalism as applied to war between robbers for the division of spoils. The richest and strongest profited and grabbed most, while the weakest were utterly robbed, tormented, crushed and strangled. The British imperialist robbers were the strongest in number of colonial slaves. The British capitalists have not lost an inch of their territory, that is, territory they have grabbed over the centuries, but they have grabbed all the German colonies in Africa. They have grabbed Mesopotamia and Palestine. They have throttled Greece and have begun to plunder Russia. The German imperialist robbers were the strongest in organization and discipline of their armies, but weaker in regard to colonies. They have lost all their colonies, but plundered half of Europe and throttled the largest number of small countries and weak nations. What a great war of liberation on both sides! How will the robbers of both groups, the Anglo-French and the German capitalists, together with their lackeys, the social chauvinists, that is, the socialists who went over to the side of their own bourgeoisie, have defended their country? The American multimillionaires were, perhaps, richest of all, and
I was just saying he's talking about the SPD there because they vote for war credits. I mean, this is one of the great splintering of the international, socialist movement, is all of these kind of socialist parties and social democratic parties break from it, and they support their own, bourgeoisie in this imperialist war where there's no winner. other than the kind of social chauvinists and like the the national capitalists.
Right. Big time for jingoism.
How will the robbers of both groups, the Anglo-French and the German capitalists, together with their lackeys, the social chauvinists, that is, the socialists who went over to the side of their own bourgeoisie, have defended their country? The American multimillionaires were, perhaps, richest of all, and geographically the most secure. They have profited more than all the rest. They have converted all, even the richest, countries into their tributaries. They have grabbed hundreds of billions of dollars. And every dollar is sullied with filth, the filth of the secret treaties between Britain and her allies, between Germany and her vassals, treaties for the division of the spoils, treaties of mutual aid for oppressing the workers and persecuting the internationalist socialists. Every dollar is sullied with the filth of profitable war contracts, which in every country made the rich richer and the poor poorer. And every dollar is stained with blood, from that ocean of blood that has been shed by the 10 million killed and 20 million maimed in the great, noble, liberating and holy war to decide whether the British or the German robbers are to get most of the spoils, whether the British or the German thugs are to be foremost in throttling the weak nations all over the world. While the German robbers broke all records in war atrocities, the British have broken all records not only in the number of colonies they have grabbed, but also in the subtlety of their disgusting hypocrisy. This very day, the Anglo-French and American bourgeois newspapers are spreading, in millions and millions of copies, lies and slander about Russia, and are hypocritically justifying their predatory expedition against her on the plea that they want to protect Russia from the Germans. It does not require many words to refute this despicable and hideous lie. It is sufficient to point to one well-known fact. In October 1917, after the Russian workers had overthrown their imperialist government, the Soviet government, the government of the revolutionary workers and peasants, openly proposed a just peace, a peace without annexations or indemnities, a peace that fully guaranteed equal rights to all nations, and it proposed such a peace to all the belligerent countries. It was the Anglo-French and the American bourgeoisie who refused to accept our proposal. It was they who even refused to talk to us about a general peace. It was they who betrayed the interests of all nations. It was they who prolonged the imperialist slaughter. It was they.
So, to note here, and I think this might be a bit where we can sort of skip forward a little bit, because what Lenin is trying to make sure is that the propagandists are not able to sully the name of the Russian Revolution, of the Bolshevik Revolution, because basically what happens is after the Bolsheviks are successful, they pull out of the out of the Great Imperialist War, out of World War One, and sign and offer a peace treaty, to all nations. In fact, offer to broker peace treaties between, the entirety of the powers at play. But yeah, the Americans, the French, and the British refuse, and then they start to sort of promote this idea because the Russians pull back, from the war with the Germans and the other Central Powers. They start to promote this idea that, the Bolsheviks have betrayed us, they've betrayed you, and they now stand with the Kaiser, right? Which is completely ludicrous. Undoubtedly, they needed to retreat. The Bolsheviks did need to retreat and sort of deal with the White Army domestically. But I don't know. From the get-go, this was always the position of the Russians. And, this comes out later, but the Germans did send Lenin back to to Russia at the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, because Lenin had been in exile for many years, and the Germans thought that he would destabilize the country. I don't know. The fact is that the revolution had already begun at that point, before Lenin came in. I don't think we would have gotten the same kind of revolution without Lenin, without a doubt. But basically, these are the kind of rumors that are going around, is that the Bolsheviks are essentially like German agents, to sort of pull them out of the war and help out the Germans.
Yeah, you still see every once in a while an odd historian try to make that case. Wasn't there a big piece that Lenin was a German agent, basically all on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Let me see if we can find... because he spends a lot of time, and I think it's important, but a lot of time sort of, making the case about why they did what they did. Let's see if we can find a good place to sort of jump back in. Later, Lenin says, the workers of the world, no matter in what country they live, greet us, sympathize with us, applaud us for breaking the iron ring of imperialist ties, of sordid imperialist treaties, of imperialist chains, for breaking through to freedom and making the heaviest sacrifice in doing so. For as a socialist republic, although torn and plundered by the imperialists, keeping out of the imperialist war and raising the banner of peace, the banner of socialism for the world, the whole world to see. And then he says, small wonder that the international imperialist gang hates us for this. They hate us, folks. If you can go to where he says a real socialist, I think is a good place to jump in.
Where is that? Where you? Oh, yep, got it. Okay, 1 second. Be ready. Just you can pull this up now.
A real socialist would not fail to understand that for the sake of achieving victory over the bourgeoisie, for the sake of power passing to the workers, for the sake of starting the world proletarian revolution, we cannot and must not hesitate to make the heaviest sacrifices, including the sacrifice of part of our territory, the sacrifice of heavy defeats at the hands of imperialism. A real socialist would have proved by deeds his willingness for his country to make the greatest sacrifice to give a real push forward to the cause of the Socialist Revolution. For the sake of their cause, that is, for the sake of winning world hegemony, the imperialists of Britain and Germany have not hesitated to utterly ruin and throttle a whole number of countries, from Belgium and Serbia to Palestine and Mesopotamia. But must socialists wait with their cause, the cause of liberating the working people of the whole world from the yoke of capital, of winning universal and lasting peace, until a path without sacrifice is found? Must they fear to open the battle until an easy victory is guaranteed? Must they place the integrity and security of their bourgeois-created fatherland above the interests of the world's socialist revolution? The scoundrels in the international socialist movement who think this way, those lackeys who grovel to bourgeois morality, thrice stand condemned. The Anglo...
This is a critical point right here, and this has actually become a big theme of this text. It's sort of learning how to tally these moments, right? Like Lenin is, making the argument here that, nationalism, the concept of the nation, is just a way to divide an international class of peoples, right? And that's the working class, right? This is an imagined fatherland, is what he says there, right? And at that moment, he's very much coming against the cowards and those who turn their back on the international socialist movement to stand with, the imperialist nations, that they live in. And I think that's a very good lesson for Americans to sort of learn how to stand properly there. But he also makes a second note, right, which is like learning to understand this kind of patience that you were getting, for example, from those in Germany who stood with German imperialism over the international proletariat, is this idea that we have to wait until certain things play out on the international historical stage, and then we can have a movement, right? But once we're sort of threatened, once the homeland is threatened by war, we have to stand with the homeland, and that's where Lenin says, must they fear to open the battle until an easy victory is guaranteed? I think that it's a pretty strong argument there that Lenin is making, and also, when you look at, say whatever you want about Stalin, maybe we'll do a Stalin episode down the line, but you can't say that the Bolshevik and Russian Revolution weren't successful in history, right? I mean, just in the fact, if you are even just using imperial tally sheets, they create a backwards country into one of the most powerful nations in human history. They have incredible achievements in reducing poverty, matched with incredible scientific and economic it was just an extremely powerful civilization, one that it's sort of funny, I think, for people our age who grew up post-Soviet Union, in a post-Soviet globe, to sort of reckon with, because Russia sort of does fall out of international its power significantly wanes in our lifetime. So the point here is that the early parts of the Soviet Union were brutal. I mean, they face a hell of a lot. Lenin's going to sort of break down some of those dynamics in a moment. But just this idea is we're just going to wait around until the conditions are just perfect. This is just it's a lesson that one of my professors at school taught me, who was Iranian, and he always said that we were all like in the third world, we're all Leninists, because Lenin is the only one who says you can make conditions for yourself. While like a lot of other of that kind of like patient European tradition was saying like we have to wait for things to open, and then we can have these movements. And unfortunately, this is one of the great tragedies of so much of these early socialist movements across Europe and even in the United States, is that they had this belief that things are going to develop into a point, and then the contradictions will just get so big, everything is going to blow up. And now you look at it, and all of those parties have completely declined. The socialist movement is very lost. That perspective has been very much,
the Fabian.
Yeah, the Fabian, but also like Kautsky on this as well. You can argue that yes, eventually the Soviet Union, collapses, and certainly, like Leo Panich is somebody who is, has significant criticisms about the Soviet Union as a system. But you can look at one group that was able to seize state power and to utilize it to some, benefit, versus others who sort of like made a lot of deals and had to, I don't know. I don't want to make the final analysis of these two schools of thought, because it's a lot, and that could be a whole episode in itself, right? But if you are to look at the history of the past century, it's two models, right? It's the model of like social democracy and parliamentary socialism, which achieves some things, but it's always under threat of sort of utter collapse, and having those powers pulled back, and I think that's very much the case, versus a kind of Leninist school, which is not without its own problems, but when it comes to actually at least being the ones finally in the halls of power, the verdict is very clear on one side there.
Well, yeah, I think it lasts as long as basically the first American Republic, won by the American Revolution, like in the plantation owners and stuff. That lasts for 80 or so years or whatever, and then collapses into the Civil War. It's a pretty good run for a fucking revolution out of a feudalism to last for decades. Britain's in the 1600s only lasted for 2 decades, and then they brought the king back, or this king's kid. So yeah, it's tough to do this, but yeah, as far as it being a success, I think just. If you're going to say it's not a success, then the American Revolution wasn't well, I guess unless you define success as capitalist hegemony, then maybe I guess the American one was more of a success. But
no, and I mean again, I'm sorry, I'm getting wrapped up in these big ideas, and I want to get back to the text, but it is worthwhile noting too that on this line that Lenin says here, when he says, but must socialists wait with their cause, the cause of liberating the working people of the world from the yoke of capital, of winning universal and lasting peace, until a path without sacrifice is found? Must they fear to open the battle until an easy victory is guaranteed? Must they place the integrity and security of their bourgeois-created fatherland above the interests of world socialist revolution? One of the great ironies and tragedies is that is exactly what Stalin ends up doing. Socialism in one country. I mean, one of the biggest differences apart from Stalin's kind of paranoid personality between Stalin and Lenin is that Stalin famously breaks with the international socialist movement, right? Takes the opposite lessons from Lenin, and then promotes the philosophy of socialism in one country, right? Which is completely, I don't know. It is a complete shift and break from Leninism, in my opinion. Lenin, anything that you read of Lenin, it is very much of the idea that we need to have it, if we do not have an internationalist working class revolution, we will lose, right? Because we will just be holding out. And Lenin was hoping that they could hold out long enough for his comrades and allies across Europe to basically be able to have the revolution. And everybody thought that it was going to come in Germany. I mean, it looked like it was going to happen. But when it doesn't, Stalin sort of shuts down. You can understand, it's hard to run a country and all that kind of stuff, but it is a great, a great tragedy, and certainly a shift from Lenin here.
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of dismissed it, but that socialism in one country thing, particularly in the context of that being his shift, it does sound like something Mussolini could have said, right? We're going to do socialism in our country, and it opens it. I think when people say Stalin is a fascist, that's what I'm saying. What's your response to when you see people say that?
I mean, we should do a Stalin. Stalin. I think is just endlessly complicated as a figure, and I hate to be slippery on this, but I think that people want to deal with him too simplistically. I think that I mean, like my quick answer on this is like there is certainly I'm not like a Stalinist or anything like that. I do see that like what happened under Stalin is a deviation. Leo Panitch has a great line when he's talking about the Soviet Union under Stalin, which is that the working class were made to be fools, right? And it's a very important notion there. It's not that they were fools, but they were actually actively like misled, and they weren't sort of brought into like the process of governing and of like building socialism. Instead, you basically had like a hard system that sits on top of society and is trying to. And I think genuinely from a lot of people within the early Soviet Union, genuinely trying to sort of like orchestrate a grand social revolution within the Soviet Union, to transfer from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. I say all that because like that condition itself does not create the basis for like a strong and good governance. And then you add in the fact that like Stalin was not unjustly like paranoid. In the sense that like there were plenty of people who were within the party who were actually like American agents, and like this is like known fact at this point, right? So what I'm saying is like the conditions create Stalin as much as Stalin creates the conditions,
Right.
and I think that sometimes people do too much of a simplistic view of Stalin, where like it's like, oh, if only like Trotsky was, if Trotsky had won out at the after Lenin's death, like it would be different. I don't know if that's frankly the case, and I know that like I've probably pissed off a lot of people who care about Soviet Union history by saying that, but like I really do think that unfortunately like a lot of these things were sort of baked in, and like Lenin was really trying to like dance with all of these. I think one of the great tragedies of like global history, frankly, is that Lenin died so early in the transition, because it's I think Stalin really ossified the system in ways that sort of made it so that it was just never like it could hold on, and it held on and did some really amazing and impressive things. Don't get me wrong. But I think pretty early on it ossified to a point, like the state itself and being able to penetrate it as like working class people. It didn't continue that work of continuing to like revolutionize society.
Right.
And I think that I don't know. I'd love to do a Stalin episode sometime because I think there is a lot to talk about. And I don't like Stalin praisers who just like create like a comic book version of him, and I don't like people who don't want to actually wrestle with the history, because it's just like the easiest thing in the world, especially as an American, to be like anti-Stalin, right?
Yeah.
Like you sort of like are taught that position early on, and I'm not saying to be pro-Stalin, but I'm just saying that like
Yeah, Stalin and Hitler are the two
you
evils.
need to do the investigation as a part of that as well. Do you get what I mean?
No, yeah, I mean the general culture that you get through osmosis is like there's two devils that sit on your shoulder, and it's Stalin and Hitler, basically, in terms of like and there's a lot of work.
You can compare those two at all.
And we saw that with like that Hitchens, Bill Maher, Prager, Gene Simmons, Whoopi Goldberg thing. Yeah.
So this next section here, we just skipped ahead a little bit. Lenin is sort of responding to people who are accusing the early Bolshevik revolution of, I don't know, being in bed with the Germans because they have signed a peace treaty with them.
The American people resorted to these tactics long ago to the advantage of their revolution, when they waged their great war of liberation against the British oppressors. They had also against them the French and the Spanish oppressors who owned a part of what is now the United States of North America. In their arduous war for freedom, the American people also entered into agreements with some oppressors against others for the purpose of weakening the oppressors and strengthening those who were fighting in a revolutionary manner against oppression, for the purpose of serving the interests of the oppressed people. The American people took advantage of the strife between the French, the Spanish, and the British. Sometimes they even fought side by side with the forces of the French and Spanish oppressors against the British oppressors. First they defeated the British, and then freed themselves from the French and the Spanish. Historical action is not the pay.
So, I mean, I just think that that's Lenin being very clear here. That it's absurd on its face of an argument to sort of say that just because a nation or an early movement like that is signing peace treaties and is deciding that they don't want to fight a certain war, means that they're sort of in love with this project. I mean, as he says very well, it's like the Americans did the exact same things with the French and the Spanish in their war against the British oppressors, right? And I think it's very much the same case in World War One.
Right.
If you could skip ahead to the next paragraph that says echoing the bourgeoisie.
Yep.
Because this is where Lenin, I think, gets really strong. And the reason this is notable is that the way Lenin is writing this piece is like peer to peer, not just peer to peer in the sense of like worker to worker, but writing as like as a member of the Soviet Union, a Bolshevik, a revolutionary in time, like in this time, to a people that he has said, as we noted at the very beginning, that he argues come from a revolutionary tradition, right? And I just find it to be interesting, both rhetorically and like theoretically, where those kind of line up. And here he's going to make an argument that is very, very, very well understood by most Americans. Now, for example, the Revolutionary War was not, a period of, great prosperity for the vast majority of people in the U.S., right? Like war creates crisis. The same thing with the Civil War, but we don't hold that as a kind of indictment of the entire system that we were living in at that time, right? And he's making that argument about, some of the things that are happening in the revolutionary, Soviet Union. Basically, there's all this propaganda about, shortages of good and of foods, and those are very serious and tragic, and he's not downplaying that at all. But sort of recognizing it's like, well, yeah, we're also like having a revolution and the entire society is upended while we try to like claw power back from the, the feudal system.
Echoing the bourgeoisie, these gentlemen like to blame us for the chaos of the revolution, for the destruction of industry, for the unemployment and the food shortage. How hypocritical these accusations are, coming from those who welcomed and supported the imperialist war, or who entered into an agreement with Kerensky, who continued this war. It is this imperialist war that is the cause of all these misfortunes. The revolution engendered by the war cannot avoid the terrible difficulties and suffering bequeathed by the prolonged, ruinous, reactionary slaughter of the nations. To blame us for the destruction of industry, or for the terror, is either hypocrisy or dull-witted pedantry. It reveals an inability to understand the basic conditions of the fierce class struggle, raised to the highest degree of intensity that is called revolution. Even when accusers of this type do recognize the class struggle, they limit themselves to verbal recognition. Actually, they constantly slip into the Philistine utopia of class agreement and collaboration. For in revolutionary epochs the class struggle has always, inevitably, and in every country, assumed the form of civil war, and civil war is inconceivable without the severest destruction, terror and the restriction of formal democracy in the interests of this war. Only unctuous parsons, whether Christian or secular in the persons of parliamentary socialists, cannot see, understand and feel this necessity. Only a lifeless man in the muffler can shun the revolution for this reason instead of plunging into battle with the utmost ardor and determination at a time when history demands that the greatest problems of humanity be solved by struggle and war. The American people have a revolutionary tradition which has been adopted by the best representatives of the American proletariat, who have repeatedly expressed their complete solidarity with us Bolsheviks. That tradition is the War of Liberation against the British in the 18th century and the Civil War in the 19th century. In some respects, if we only take into consideration the destruction of some branches of industry and of the national economy, America in 1870 was behind 1860. But what a pedant, what an idiot would anyone be to deny on these grounds the immense, world historic, progressive and revolutionary significance of the American Civil War of 1863 to 65. The
Oh, you're muted.
I love that point so much. I mean, what an idiot would say that, like, production went down in 1870 when compared to 1860. This was a bad war. It's pretty rich.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, Megan McArdle would probably.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
You know, she's like the crazy libertarian author who makes the argument to folks that, oh, because you can enjoy strawberries, your life is better than a king. You know, to people who are like afraid of all of their possessions being taken from them by debt collectors and,
Yeah.
and folks like that. You know, who cannot live without going to work for somebody else. I don't find that to be very king-like, but no, I mean, like, I think that like that first point about like, yeah, of course, you know, and it's a very basic point, frankly, is that like revolution does not, you know, immediately you know, better conditions, but you're breaking down the systems of pure evil. And I have to say, I love to think of the Russian Revolution in that kind of tradition that Lenin is putting up here as well, of like extensions of these early democratic revolutions, and most importantly of the American like Civil War. And I don't know, it feels quite like it's something of, you know, that we should take as a badge of honor, that, you know, that these revolutions are like are part of the American tradition as well. And, you know, in this case, like Lenin is also including them in like the kind of general march of progress and history.
Yeah, totally.
And yeah, let's go to this. I mean, these next two paragraphs are great, so let me just jump right into them.
Yeah, the representatives of the bourgeois, that's where we're at, right?
Yeah.
Oh, ready when you put me up.
Oh, excuse me.
The representatives of the bourgeoisie understand that for the sake of overthrowing Negro slavery, of overthrowing the rule of the slave owners, it was worth letting the country go through long years of civil war, through the abysmal ruin, destruction and terror that accompany every war. But now, when we are confronted with the vastly greater task of overthrowing capitalist wage slavery, of overthrowing the rule of the bourgeoisie, now, the representatives and defenders of the bourgeoisie, and also the reformist socialists who have been frightened by the bourgeoisie and are shunning the revolution, cannot and do not want to understand that civil war is necessary and legitimate. The American workers will not follow the bourgeoisie. They will be with us, for civil war against the bourgeoisie. The whole history of the world and of the American labor movement strengthens my conviction that this is so. I also recall the words of one of the most beloved leaders of the American proletariat, Eugene Debs, who wrote in the Appeal to Reason, I believe towards the end of 1915, in the article What Shall I Fight For?, that he, Debs, would rather be shot than vote credits for the present criminal and reactionary war. That he, Debs, knows of only one holy and, from the proletarian standpoint, legitimate war, namely, the war against the capitalists, the war to liberate mankind from wage slavery. I am not surprised that Wilson, the head of the American multimillionaires and servant of the capitalist sharks, has thrown Debs into prison. Let the bourgeoisie be brutal to the true internationalists, to the true representatives of the revolutionary proletariat. The more fierce and brutal they are, the nearer the day of the victorious proletarian revolution. We are blamed for the destruction caused by our
I mean, there's a lot of juice right there that is just worth noting. One, I love the Lenin to Debs. You know, I love the, you know, the head nod right there.
Right.
But two, I mean, I think recognizing people, I think, and there rightfully has been, you know, such a revitalized interest in Eugene Debs, and I think that it's great. I do wonder, you know, sometimes I don't see, at least maybe, I don't see his like principled opposition to World War I. A lot of people obviously note the fact that he was in prison, but people sort of just see that as an extension of his like commitment, and, you know, like his resolve against like the odds. But this, like, the opposition to World War I was like no small part of the socialist tradition. Like, they found this to not just be like, oh, we're upholding our principles and like standing by our beliefs, but that like opposing this war in and of itself was actually going to be critical for advancing the class struggle. And I think that position has been sort of borne out by history, is that the movements that were unable to sort of break from the nationalist fervor, you do start to see those become much more co-opted and corrupted, versus the movements that from the get-go, like Debs, said, you know, I'm not going to vote for war credits, and, you know, I'd rather be shot than go and fight a worker abroad, right? And these are really, really crucial parts of this period of like socialist thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just looking a little bit ahead too, and he does mention, I forgot that he does this, but he mentions the British 1649ers. The British bourgeois have forgotten their 1649. The French bourgeois have forgotten their, yeah.
And I also just like, I just have to say, like, I love just reading somebody like Lenin talk about American politics and American history in like this kind of language, because you can see where it's unique, right?
Yeah, but I think it's important, but you also see the landmarks and like the Wilson and Debs and stuff like that. And I think it's really important to get different passes over this history from particularly people who played such a role as Lenin. Because I think it really, and that's why I needed to read it, but I have a book on Marx and his relationship over pen with Lincoln. And like that sort of stuff, like I think it really shrinks the world in a way that makes it a lot more comprehensible.
No, I think for sure. Yeah, and then, like, I love the line, Wilson, the head of the American millionaires and the servant of the capitalist sharks.
Yeah, that's so good.
Let's bring that back. So yeah,
we are blamed for the destruction caused by our revolution. Who are the accusers? The hangers-on of the bourgeoisie, of that very bourgeoisie who, during the 4 years of the imperialist war, have destroyed almost the whole of European culture and have reduced Europe to barbarism, brutality and starvation. These bourgeoisie now demand we should not make a revolution on these ruins, amidst this wreckage of culture, amidst the wreckage and ruins created by the war. Nor were the people who have been brutalized by the war. How humane and righteous the bourgeoisie are. Their servants accuse us of resorting to terror. The British bourgeoisie have forgotten their 1649, the French bourgeoisie have forgotten their 1793. Terror was just and legitimate when the bourgeoisie resorted to it for their own benefit against feudalism. Terror became monstrous and criminal when the workers and poor peasants dared to use it against the bourgeoisie. Terror was just and legitimate when used for the purpose of substituting one exploiting minority for another exploiting minority. Terror became monstrous and criminal when it began to be used for the purpose of overthrowing every exploiting minority, to be used in the interests of the vast actual majority. In the interests of the proletariat and semi-proletariat, the working class and the poor peasants. The international imperialist bourgeoisie have slaughtered 10 million men and maimed 20 million in their war. The war to decide whether the British or the German vultures are to rule the world. If our war, the war of the oppressed and exploited against the oppressors and the exploiters, results in 500,000 or 1 million casualties in all countries, the bourgeoisie will say that the former casualties are justified, while the latter are criminal.
And I'm sorry, I mean, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
This is like a PragerU, like a response to a PragerU video in some ways, right? This is the kind of argument they continue to make is, and often I don't find sometimes, spend too much time working through these tolls and debunking things, to be like the most valuable use of time. Just because I don't know, human life is human life. But like, I don't know. What I'm saying is that, Prager and all those guys, they use these insane statistics, right? When they talk about, for example, the Soviet Union, that includes things like abortions, right?
Yeah.
Where they're like, oh, well, all these babies were killed because, women have access to contraceptives, right? And all this kind of wild stuff. And I do think it's worthwhile for us to actually have that real history. If you are debating with someone, I don't find that to be the best use of your time to just sort of be okay, well, these deaths, these numbers are wrong here, as much as it is to make this argument that Lenin's making. I think it's just much easier for people to grasp. It's all these millions of people die in World War One, to decide who's going to be the winner of the imperialist challenge, 1917. And then, people die, in a war to sort of break these chains. I don't know. I just don't find them to be comparable.
Yeah, I mean, it's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And if you had an actual accounting of deaths for the construction of a state, America would completely swamp any other one, unless you decide there's a reason you don't include the just I mean, more than decimation is only 10%. We get up to 90% of a lot of Native American tribes decimated by disease and then subsequent warfare, taking advantage of that. And like, I guess like that doesn't make those statistics, right?
No, exactly. And again, like I feel like it's just a very cruel game to, again, to like just put up numbers against each other, because it completely decontextualizes what's going on, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have brutal people who are standing for like, are fighting to maintain like power and privilege and the right to control other people's lives, in the American context, in the Civil War, to literally own people, right? And I don't think that like sitting there and counting up numbers like tells you what actually is going on in that context, right?
Yep.
All right. Yeah.
The proletariat will have something entirely different to say. Now, amidst the horrors of the imperialist war, the proletariat is receiving a most vivid and striking illustration of the great truth taught by all revolutions and bequeathed to the workers by their best teachers, the founders of modern socialism. This truth is that no revolution can be successful unless the resistance of the exploiters is crushed. When we, the workers and toiling peasants, captured state power, it became our duty to crush the resistance of the exploiters. We are proud we have been doing this. We regret we are not doing it with sufficient firmness and determination. We know that fierce resistance to the socialist revolution on the part of the bourgeoisie is inevitable in all countries, and that this resistance will grow with the growth of this revolution.
That's true.
The proletariat will crush this resistance. During the struggle against the resisting bourgeoisie, it will finally mature for victory and for power. Let the corrupt bourgeois press shout to the whole world about every mistake our revolution makes. We are not daunted by our mistakes. People have not become saints because the revolution has begun. The toiling classes who for centuries have been oppressed, downtrodden and forcibly held in the vice of poverty, brutality and ignorance cannot avoid mistakes when making a revolution. And, as I pointed out once before, the corpse of bourgeois society cannot be nailed in a coffin and buried. The corpse of capitalism is decaying and disintegrating in our midst, polluting the air and poisoning our lives, enmeshing that which is new, fresh, young and virile in thousands of threads and bonds of that which is old, moribund and decaying. For every 100 mistakes we commit, and which the bourgeoisie and their lackeys shout about to the whole world, 10,000 great and heroic deeds are performed, greater and more heroic because they are simple and inconspicuous amidst the everyday life of a factory district or a remote village, performed by people who are not accustomed to shout to the whole world about their successes.
I just wanted to note here, because this is something that does, end up shifting post-Lenin. Is like Lenin is very much admitting too that like, this process is not a perfect process, right? Like a revolution is not something where you just like sort of step, somebody throws you the keys to the car and just ready made to go, right? It's like, you have to build and you have to crush some older systems, and mistakes will be made. But again, it's like not having this the kind of fixation on like just zeroing into like one event, to sort of tell you what is the truth of the character of this movement. And instead of zooming out, like I'm saying, going back to that first text we read about like understanding the kind of toolbox that Marxism gives us, right? Instead of sort of zooming in on one event and only viewing it in that kind of context and being able to actually have this larger view of history and these movements, doesn't like absolves everybody's like morality. In fact, Lenin makes the argument here too, is that essentially that the feudal system and the brutality that most people have been brought up into does not create good people, right? And even like amongst their own ranks, like there are people who are doing bad things, right. And it is not absolving them, but it is also saying like we cannot let this sort of be how we paint and understand a revolutionary movement and moment. I mean, like, frankly, like, this is one thing that, like, revisionists get a lot, just to go back to the Civil War, where I think people probably are much more determined as to which side is the good one versus the bad one. But there are plenty of stories in the Civil War of, like, northern, like, severe brutality, not just to soldiers, but to people, right? And those moments, are absolutely horrific, and we shouldn't like deny the humanity of like bad, the fact that bad things are happening to people, right? But like, does that change the righteousness of like the cause to vanquish slavery? No, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, as like in the South, like this is a big part of how they tried to like create this lost cause mythology, saying like, oh well, look what happened to this town.
Yeah.
The town was raised, and yeah.
And that's I mean, I think that is almost you see that in the Spanish Civil War. It's atrocity. It's who can outdo who with the atrocity stories and propagandize them better, right? And I mean, I think that goes back eons and eons. Like, look at, they did that to us, and let's shut up about what we did to their women, right? Like that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, exactly. And like, this is like, and it's very understandable why you can have that reaction to some of those stories and moments. But the point is, like, this is where arming yourself with this kind of historical perspective, this materialist perspective, sort of breaks you from the kind of trappings of just like, I don't know, bourgeois morality, where you're like, oh well, both sides have done bad things. It's like, yeah. I mean, as Lenin says, it's like, we could make 10,000 mistakes, and still like the cause of breaking the power of wage slavery in this country, of feudal power in this country, is the righteous and correct path to take.
Yeah.
But even if the contrary were true, although I know such an assumption is wrong, even if we committed 10,000 mistakes for every 100 correct actions we performed, even in that case our revolution would be great and invincible, and so it will be in the eyes of world history, because, for the first time, not the minority, not the rich alone, not the educated alone, but the real people, the vast majority of the working people, are themselves building a new life, are by their own experience solving the most difficult problems of socialist organization. Every mistake committed in the course of such work, in the course of this most conscientious and earnest work of tens of millions of simple workers and peasants in reorganizing their whole life, every such mistake is worth thousands and millions of lawless successes achieved by the exploiting minority, successes in swindling and duping the working people. For only through such mistakes will the workers and peasants learn to build the new life, learn to do without capitalists. Only in this way will they hack a path for themselves, through thousands of obstacles, to victorious socialism. Mistakes are being committed in the course of their revolutionary work by our peasants, who at one stroke, in one night, October 25th to 26th, 1917, entirely abolished the private ownership of land, and are now, month after month, overcoming tremendous difficulties and correcting their mistakes themselves, solving in a practical way the most difficult tasks of organizing new conditions of economic life, of fighting the kulaks, providing land for the working people, and of changing to communist large-scale agriculture. Mistakes are being committed in the course of their revolutionary work by our workers, who have already, after a few months, nationalized almost all the biggest factories and plants, and are learning by hard, everyday work the new task of managing whole branches of industry, are setting the nationalized enterprises going, overcoming the powerful resistance of inertia, petty bourgeois mentality and selfishness, and, brick by brick, are laying the foundation of new social ties, of a new labor discipline, of a new influence of the workers' trade unions over their members. Mistakes are committed in the course of their revolutionary work by our Soviets, which were created as far back as 1905 by a mighty upsurge of the people. The Soviets of workers and peasants are a new type of state, a new and higher type of democracy, a form of the proletarian dictatorship, a means of administering the state without the bourgeoisie and against the bourgeoisie. For the first time democracy is here serving the people, the working people, and has ceased to be democracy for the rich as it still is in all bourgeois republics, even the most democratic. For the first time, the people are grappling, on a scale involving 100 million, with the problem of implementing the dictatorship of the proletariat and semi-proletariat, a problem which, if not solved, makes socialism out of the question.
I mean, I just wanted to note that, like, this is a very specific moment in history, right? The early Soviet period. And to go back to, like, the Panish example from earlier about, the people are made into fools. It's like, it is this process that is critical and it is one that is sort of lacking in world history for transitioning from capitalism to socialism. Not just the fact that things are upended, but it is the people themselves figuring out how to build these new kind of social forms. And one of the great tragedies of like the Soviet Union is that you have this great revolutionary period where so much is upended and sort of reimagined and recreated, and then that process sort of is ossified and sort of stops, right? And it's stopped top down, right? This is the replacement of like a bottom up revolution from a top down bureaucracy that ends up becoming the dominant form in the Soviet Union. But it is this kind of moment, right, where it's like it's not peaceful and it's not perfect and it's not always necessarily pretty. But it is beautiful in its own way, right? The idea of millions of people coming together trying to create something new, when we don't have the guidebook to figuring out exactly like what is new labor discipline in a world without capitalism, right? If we're not living in a world where like coercion and hunger are sort of used by the bosses to get people to show up to work every day, how do we create new social ties and new social bonds and new ways of thinking that get you to show up and do the socially necessary work, to sustain ourselves, right? Like figuring those problems out are very serious ones, and we don't have like necessarily the clearest answer to. And even if we think and we hypothesize what those answers are, it is only like in the actual practice that we're able to test those ideas and to develop them and to change them where necessary to meet those needs, right? Like this is like the hard work of revolution, and it really was happening at an amazing level at this period of time. But again, you have two crises. The first crisis is that essentially, the imperialist powers are trying to destroy the Soviet Union from the get-go. And then you also do still have, the internal kind of social divisions between whites, people who are anti-Soviet, and people who are Reds. And then obviously it only gets worse when Lenin, passes away so early on in the Soviet Union. The system. You basically have people who now they control like the arms of the state and the military, and they stop this process pretty damn quick. I mean, Lenin, completely like not even talking about like social production or anything like that. Like Lenin and the early Soviets, like they completely radicalized marriage. I talk about this all the time in relation to the Soviet Union, right? The postcard divorce, but along with many other kind of like social reforms that happen. Stalin completely ends those. He ends, like things like free abortion, and all of these kind of progressive things that were sort of achieved in the early Soviet Union. And when I asked some people who are a lot more like not loyal, but like sympathetic to Stalin than I am, they said things like, "Well, you can't like upend so much of society when you essentially are bunkered down and at war." And I think for me, like right then and there, it's like this is like the kind of the fault of what happens with the Soviet Union, is that like there is this kind of bunker mentality. It's like we can't do the good things and the progressive things that we want to do because we're at war, and that war ain't going anywhere. So like you have to find a way to bolster those kind of social revolutions internally and to beat the imperialist powers. And like undoubtedly that's difficult, and that's why Lenin lean so hard on the idea of international revolution. But like once you take away the idea of international revolution and then ossifying society and stopping the democratic process, and I don't just mean in the kind of like BS like way that most people think about it, like voting every 4 years, like the idea of like power being shared by people,
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I've been going.
Well, I just wanted to say on the topic of the dictatorship of the proletariat, like that's a concept that has become entirely like unscary and desirable for me. Like when you have a appreciation of what we've been living under, which is dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and like which has absolutely been borne out since this was written. Not only America getting involved and trying to crush this revolution, but just in the CIA's activities. The entire existence of that organization, or COINTEL locally, or even just like the gerrymandered political system, which is, of course, like helps minority rule Republicans, but helps suburban rule of both parties. Like of course, like we bring on proletarian dictatorship.
Well, I mean, this is sometimes I wonder how much of this is like translation of terms too that like is frightening to people. Like like I don't know, like it's different because it's Chinese, but like when people say the term like Mao Zedong thought, right? Everyone's like, oh my god, that sounds so like like, scary and authoritarian. It's like, well, that's just literally just like how you would sort of say like Mao Zedong's like philosophy, right?
Right.
I don't know. And what I mean by like the dictatorship of the proletariat, as you said, like, yeah, it's exactly this kind of concept of, yeah, we're breaking down powers of bosses. Like we do not recognize the power of the bourgeoisie of the class. That doesn't mean that we don't recognize the individual. That doesn't mean that we don't recognize all these other things. But yeah, the rights and privileges afforded to certain people because of their like relationship to the means of production. Fuck that shit.
Yeah. Exactly.
Let's see. I guess we're almost at the end, so we can just
You should let it ride.
let's let it ride, and then we can sort of put in our final thoughts.
Cool. Let me just bump this up. And you want to put her up?
Oh, excuse me. Yeah.
Let the pedants, or the people whose minds are incurably stuffed with bourgeois democratic or parliamentary prejudices, shake their heads in perplexity about our Soviets. About the absence of direct elections, for example. These people have forgotten nothing and have learned nothing during the period of the great upheavals of 1914 to 18. The combination of the proletarian dictatorship with the new democracy for the working people, of civil war with the widest participation of the people in politics, such a combination cannot be brought about at one stroke, nor does it fit in with the outworn modes of routine parliamentary democracy. The contours of a new world, the world of socialism, are rising before us in the shape of the Soviet Republic. It is not surprising that this world does not come into being ready-made, does not spring forth like Minerva from the head of Jupiter. The old bourgeois democratic constitutions wax eloquent about formal equality and right of assembly. But our proletarian and peasant Soviet constitution casts aside the hypocrisy of formal equality. When the bourgeois republicans overturned thrones, they did not worry about formal equality between monarchists and republicans. When it is a matter of overthrowing the bourgeoisie, only traitors or idiots can demand formal equality of rights for the bourgeoisie.
Oh, shit. Okay. I gotta do a different...
Do we have to change the voice, or can we...
let's see. Ah, shit. Okay, hold on. Let me... I'll have to use a different program.
We're so close to the end, we could just read the most important paragraph. I can just read that out to us.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I guess we'll just restart. Y'all are going to get a treat here. I'm going to read out the last bit of it because our computer broke down on us. The old bourgeois democratic constitutions wax eloquent about formal equality and the right of assembly, but our proletarian and peasant Soviet constitution casts aside the hypocrisy. Oh, excuse me, we already had that. Are y'all getting the treat? I'm about to read the rest out for us. Our Soviets have confiscated all the buildings in town and country from the rich and have transferred all of them to the workers and peasants for their unions and meetings. This is our freedom of assembly for the working people. This is the meaning and content of our socialist constitution. That is why we are also firmly convinced that no matter what misfortunes may still be in store for it, our Republic of Soviets is invincible. It is invincible because every blow struck by frenzied imperialism, every defeat the international bourgeoisie inflicts on us, rouses more and more sections of the workers and peasants to struggle, teaches them at the cost of enormous sacrifice, steals them, engenders them new heroism on a mass scale. I just wanted to note here that one reason that Lenin is so great, I think, as both like a politician, a theoretician, as a writer, is he can really just cut through ideology, right? So when he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, he's talking about these distinctions between, for example, mass assembly. What is the freedom of assembly of the Soviet Union, right? He's like, well, unlike, for example, the bourgeois republics, where it's like this is something that's codified as like an abstract law. He's saying right here is like, we have seized the land and the buildings from the people who owned them before, and we have given them from the people for their own use. We have given them to the workers to hold union meetings. We have given them to do political education, right? It's breaking down like the kind of formal ideology that you have of like, kind of like bourgeois American like style capitalism, right? And he's using the terms that you're sort of understand, and he sort of breaks through the way that those like challenges that like, oh, the Soviets are sort of anti-democratic because of this and that, and saying like, no, this is actually like the true expression of these kind of democratic ideals, right? I find that to be endlessly like refreshing in Lenin. We know that help from you, he's talking about the Americans, will probably not come soon. This is the interesting and kind of, because this is such a triumphant piece. Like the Soviets is invincible. We're reading in 2021 in a very different world 100 years later.
Yeah.
But anyways, he's talking to the Americans here. He says, we know that help from you will probably not come soon, comrade American workers. For the revolution is developing in different countries in different forms and at different tempos, and it cannot be otherwise. We know that although the European proletarian revolution has been maturing very rapidly lately, it may, after all, not flare up within the next weeks. We are banking on the inevitability of the world revolution, but this does not mean that we are such fools as to bank on the revolution inevitably coming on the definite side and early date. We have seen two great revolutions in our country, 1905 and 1917, and we know revolutions are not made to order or by agreement. We know that circumstance brought our Russian detachment of the socialist proletariat to the fore, not because of our merits, but because of the exponential backwardness of Russia, and that before the world revolution breaks out, a number of separate revolutions may be defeated. In spite of this, we are firmly convinced that we are invincible because the spirit of mankind will not be broken by the imperialist slaughter. Mankind will vanquish it. And the first country to break the convict chains of the imperialist war was our country. We sustained enormously heavy casualties in the struggle to break these chains, but we broke them. We are free from imperialist dependence. We have raised the banner of struggle for the complete overthrow of imperialism for the whole world to see. We are now, as it were, in a besieged fortress, waiting for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief. These detachments exist. They are more numerous than ours. They are maturing, growing, gaining more strength the longer the brutalities of imperialism continues. The workers are breaking away from the social traders, the Gomperses, the Hendersons, the Renaudels, the Schneidermans, and Renners. Slowly but surely, the workers are adopting communist Bolshevik tactics and are marching toward the proletarian revolution, which alone is capable of saving dying culture and dying mankind. In short, we are invincible because the world proletarian is invincible. Lenin, August 20th, 1918. It riles you up a little bit, and I have to say, like, it gets you both excited and a little sad.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Like, set aside like what it must, because we have no experience of what a Soviet Union existing was, right? Like we came right after that. The only imagination I have is like in the fucking Americans, or what's really interesting is like in like the 1940s or like era, like 30s, like that sort of discussion of like, or even like after this, right? Like how that example before it is turned into like, oh my God, Stalin, right? When it's still like this existing counter model. It'd be really nice to have something like that still existing.
Yeah, I mean, on that kind of mass scale, or at least as involved.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because like there are countries with different models out there, but they have sort of become, even the larger ones, islands in of themselves, and understandably so. Because the tragic history, like, I don't want to sit here and and be such a fanboy to say something that people might find to be ridiculous, but like Lenin is absolutely 100% right on all of these points that he's making. Even the idea that the revolution is coming. I think the thing that Lenin doesn't foresee is just the discipline and tenacity and brutality with which both the American and the Western European bourgeoisie are going to like organize themselves to crush this possibility, both internally and internationally. I mean, in England, shortly after this, I mean, the secret police are essentially arresting people for being communists. Germany, we all know what happens there with a horrible right wing reaction that ends up following the Weimar Republic, and even before then, the betrayal of the SPD, to the International Revolution, right? Like it takes an incredible amount of resource and strategizing to sort of crush this this movement that seemed like history was sort of trending in that direction. And we all know the story in the United States. I mean, he is writing there saying like, oh, it'll take some time to develop, but you're living in the United States over those next 15 years. I mean, it feels like it could be coming at any time, or at least it's going to start to like really, really explode. And it is these kind of reactionary trade union movements in the United States that play such a great role in sort of destroying the early organizational capacity of the communists. I mean, yeah, and that's like the beauty. Like, as I love the feeling of like the excitement that Lenin's writing with here, and then knowing sort of how it's going to play out is devastating.
And that excitement gets channeled in domestically in America into like the New Deal sort of shift. It is really depressing, and it's funny, like you mentioned that thing about Stalin reversing the social policy, because you see the exact same basically reversion to in the Dakota like farm populists. There was a lot more of that social sort of like progressiveness. And then once you actually get into power in the 30s, it becomes like frankly, like a white farmer patriarch party, and they do a lot of stuff. They take on capitalists, and that legacy still is important to this day. Nonetheless, like, did you sort of defang some of like the actual potential of it when making those decisions that we're going to basically construct a capitalism that works for farmers for a little bit until like I guess the 70s and 80s, when the monopolies can come back again and take that land finally.
No, I mean, I agree with you so much, and like this is something just to put it into contemporary discourse too. I mean, there's this kind of fanciful belief that like what we need to be doing is like sort of like mild to maybe even radical like class politics, but merge it with like a kind of like socially reactionary, socially conservative politics. That has not been borne out by history as a kind of model that you want to emulate. In fact, it was these kind of radical movements that were demanding the shifts not just in capitalism, but also in the kind of politics of the home, and the politics of gender, the politics of race. Right? Those things have always been connected, and I think it is really notable that like the first thing Lenin gives a speech, and maybe it'll be a good one for a further Lenin reading. But like it's one of my favorite Lenin moments because it's like 1920. And he gives his like great speech to like the Congress of the Congress of the Soviets, right? It's like a triumphant revolutionary moment. Like they finally, for the most part, have like dispelled the power of the whites and the counter-revolution. And you think Lenin is going to stand here on this 3-year anniversary of the revolution and be like, "We're the best." And he just goes into this whole tirade about how the revolution has not gone far enough in the improvement of the lives of women. Right, and it had already, by most country standards at that time, far exceeded them. But he's basically lambasting them and says, like, there is no freedom for working people as long as women are still enslaved by the laws of man, right? And it's like, this is like a revolutionary energy that is like not just unique to Lenin, but like is throughout these kind of movements of not seeing these kind of fights as separate. And I think that it's really dangerous for some people to correctly react to kind of like corporate wokeism, right? The kind of garbage that they're trying to shove down everybody's throats. And I think that the correct reaction is to become reactionary or conservative. But rather, what we should be doing is trying to untether these social demands from the interests of capital, because they're trying to defang and divide a movement and correct movements. I think for a lot of social and justice within our society, right? Don't let them detether that, untangle that from like the radical demands to address the system of capitalism, which creates the vast majority of those problems in the first place.
Yeah, and just another like the track record of that. There's these letters between John Adams and his wife, Abigail, and she says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands." I'd love Abigail and Lenin to have a conversation.
That would be fascinating.
And John Adams is like, yeah, that's hilarious. It was just, I mean, literally, I that was like how I summarized it. Here's the very first line: "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh." So there's There's John Adams' response.
Oh, that's so perfect. Yeah, I mean, we've gone on for a while. And I thank everybody for hanging out with us. Please let us know, one, what you're thinking. I'm always curious what people take away from these texts, and if you enjoy this format. Two, I mean, if I were to just summarize, I mean, I think that Lenin makes a really great argument of sort of understanding what goes into a revolution. I think sometimes people get very fanciful about them. It's like, it's going to be like, if that were to happen in your lifetime, it's a very difficult time. It's not something that you should take lightly. I think that's a really important argument. I think the historical arguments about imperialism are fascinating. I think the arguments he's making about the American tradition are phenomenal. But also his ability to cut through just these bullshit kind of talking points of like bourgeois democracy, right? And like, freedom of speech, etc., right? And he's sort of always able to just like rip through that kind of like very bizarre and zoomed out concept of what those things mean, and actually put them on their own feet in the world today, and to make the challenge the correct one, in my opinion. That like the working class movements are much better stewards of those kind of values of free speech, of free assembly, of democracy, than the capitalists who want to control your labor and everything else in the world.
Yeah, I mean that especially the free speech thing. Like, what better example and proof of Lenin's warnings about like those sort of bourgeois rights is like the Citizens United era, where we literally like convert that. Instead of like the implicit, like we know that free speech is freer for some other people for this entire fucking like history. Well, now we need to literally just say like actually money is speech, literally. I think
no, and I feel like Lenin. Again, this is the fascinating thing between Lenin as like a thinker and a revolutionary. Like, it would be a great vindication of so many of the arguments that Lenin's making about bourgeois freedom, right? To see Citizens United, come into place, right? To say that, oh yeah, corporations have the freedom to buy votes. Corporations have the freedom to buy politicians is truly one of the great encapsulations of that kind of Marxist critique of, bourgeois democratic like values. Like, see what they actually mean in practice.
Yeah.
And a famous line of Lenin is like, on freedom of speech is like, I think this is a good way to distill it. It's like, somebody's like, oh, well, what about the concept of freedom of speech? And Lenin responds to him, he says like, freedom for who and freedom to do what? Right.
Yeah.
And it's just like, those are the secondary questions that like, I think a lot of political liberalism sort of leaves out.
Absolutely. Well, and again, it's like, when he's complaining about the press, who's running the press in that time in history? Who's running it now, right? It's fucking capitalists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a lot of fun. We went for a while. I hope you all enjoyed. Matt and I will be back next week. Hang out with us, our show notes. I'll be back on Tuesday for the stream as well. I hope you have a nice Sunday.
See you, folks.